Hi, my name is André Gagné. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I have to ask a question. What is it with some evangelicals that say that Trump is comparable to the great King Cyrus, the Persian king that lived in the 6th century, responsible for defeating the Babylonian Empire? It's hard to understand sometimes where the logic comes from, especially from evangelical groups that read the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. They read into the Bible certain contemporary events, and they make comparisons between biblical figures and modern day individuals or modern day events. I came across this book from Dr. Lance Wallnau, who's a very important key player in the evangelical circles. And he wrote this book in 2016 called God's Chaos Candidate, Donald J. Trump and the American Unraveling. And essentially the premise of his book, I'm not going to talk about the entire book, but I'm going to talk about the premise of his book, is to say that Donald Trump is comparable, or at least has the anointing, the blessing, was chosen by God, like King Cyrus was chosen by God at a particular time in the history of the Jewish people. So Donald Trump at the particular time, at this particular time of the American, in the history of America, in the history of the US, has been chosen by God, like Cyrus has been chosen by God. So Donald Trump is this new Cyrus. He has the Cyrus anointing. That's essentially his premise. And he bases himself on an insight, a vision, a supernatural revelation that God supposedly gave him. And he explains that in his book. At one point, he was reflecting on Trump, realizing that Trump would be the 45th president of the United States. Barack Obama had been the 44th president. Even if he had won 2 terms, Trump would be the 45th. Because he wrote, I have to say that he wrote this book before the election. Right? So he predicted that Trump, or he prophesied, like he says, that Trump would win the election. So he thought about Trump being this 45th, 45th president of the United States. And at one point in his heart, he felt that God was telling him to go read Isaiah chapter 45, which speaks of Cyrus. And from that, he elaborates this theory that God chose Trump as a modern day Cyrus to restore his people, to restore God's people in America. Of course, the book of Isaiah doesn't talk about Trump. It doesn't talk about the people of America. It talks about the Jews, the restoration of the Jews, the ability that they had to go back to their country, to restore their city and temple, rebuild their temple after being exiled in Babylonia. So he makes that comparison, and he justifies this through some kind of supernatural revelation. Now, there's a couple of problems with doing that. First of all, it's not taking into consideration what the Bible really says about Cyrus, and making these direct correlations between Cyrus and Trump, and really not understanding the historical context in which Cyrus came about at a specific time in the 6th century before Common Era. So that in and of itself is a problem. And it's surprising because Wallnau is going to say that he has a degree in theology. I don't know if it's his doctoral degree or if he has a bachelor's in theology, but he never realized that God and the Bible could use secular individuals, or at least that's how the writers of the ancient prophets, prophetic writings, understood, often after the fact, that God had, that's how they interpret history, that God had used individuals, chosen specific individuals, despite the fact that they did not or did not know God, or didn't belong to the Judaic traditions. God still chose them. So he was surprised by that. It's surprising that he was surprised by that, because this is exactly what the book of Isaiah says about Cyrus. Cyrus is a pagan king. He's not a Jew in any shape or form. Now, apart from that, there are issues with kind of connecting this idea of the 45th president of the United States being and making a correlation with Isaiah 45, because Cyrus' first mention is not in Isaiah 45, but it's at the end of chapter 44 of the book of Isaiah. So that in and of itself is problematic. He talks, the writer of Isaiah talks about Cyrus for the first time in that specific moment. He also does not know, or at least the writer of this book is unaware of the fact that when we're reading Isaiah, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah chapter 1 up till chapter 39, scholarship has clearly identified that as being a writing that was most likely composed by the prophet Isaiah that lived in the 8th century. So Isaiah, the prophet himself, lived in the 8th century. And the first 39 chapters corresponds pretty much to what he would have written. When we come to chapters 40 to 55, chapters 40 to 55 were not written by the same individual that wrote the first part of the book of Isaiah, and then chapters 56 to the end were not also written by the same individual. So there are 3 sections of the writing of the book of Isaiah that were written at different moments, at different time periods. So the section that deals with chapters 40 to chapter 55 is in scholarly language called the second Isaiah, or the Deutero-Isaiah. And those chapters were written in the 6th century. So we're very far from the 8th century. So when Wallnau says that Isaiah prophesied 150 years prior to the coming of Cyrus, he prophesied the coming of this Persian king, no. The writer of that second portion of the book of Isaiah was alive at the time of Cyrus, the Persian king. So when the writer, or at least the prophet Isaiah, the one who lived in the 8th century, was around, there was no Persian empire, right? There was no Cyrus, and Babylonia was just one of the cities that was part of the Assyrian Empire. So there's a discrepancy there, just understanding what the book of Isaiah is all about. So he doesn't get that, and it's surprising that God would have necessarily told him these things without making him realize that, you're not dealing exactly with the same individual. So it's not a prophecy about Cyrus. So the writer in the second Isaiah is not necessarily prophesying the coming of Cyrus. Cyrus is already around at that time period. So that needs to be very, very clear. It's not a prophecy. The other thing concerning this, and one of the ways, there are several ways that we can kind of discern why there are differences in those 3 sections. First of all, when we talk about the 8th century prophet Isaiah himself, he wrote, like I said, in the 8th century. The writer of the second portion lived in the 6th century. And those oracles in chapters 40 to 55 were probably, and pretty clearly, that has been demonstrated on scholarly grounds, were written somewhere between 550 and 539 before Common Era. So the portion on Cyrus is not a prediction of a coming Persian ruler. He was already around. So that's very very much important. Cyrus himself lived between 600 and BCE and 530. He died in 530 BCE. So the differences between these portions, the first part, let's say, we're not going to focus on the last part, but the first part, chapters 1 to 39 and chapters 40 to 55, the differences are clear. First of all, in the first 39 chapters, the name of Isaiah appears 16 times just in these 39 chapters, whereas in the last 27 chapters of what we call the book of Isaiah, the name Isaiah does not occur anywhere. So that in and of itself, we see that these sections seem to be more anonymous oracles. The style of writing is really different also from the first part, chapters 1 to 39, and the second part, chapters 40 to 55. The mood is much more positive in the second portion than in the first portion. So the mood is positive. People that are captive in Babylonia need to be encouraged. They need hope. So the writer of that second portion is much more upbeat, much more positive about the final outcome of the Jewish exiles. The literary form, other stylistic devices, the vocabulary that is used, the imagery that is used is very, very much different than the first section. And the other section is what I mentioned, is the historical situation between the first 39 chapters and chapters 40 to 55. So very different from the 8th century writer of the first portion of Isaiah to the second portion of Isaiah, which is a 6th century writer that was probably amongst the Jewish exiles himself in Babylonia. And so that's very, very much important to understand. What we need to consider also is when the writer talks about Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, for the writer of the second portion of Isaiah, had a profound impact because he pronounces oracles, specific oracles that deal with Cyrus, and he in a sense predicts the overthrow of the Babylonians and the liberation of the Jews. So you see this across certain chapters, for example, chapter 41, chapter 44, chapter 45, chapter 46, and chapter 47. We see that there are predictions, positive predictions, about the destruction of Babylonia and a possible liberation of the Jews. However, the writer was partially wrong about the destruction of Babylon, which is described in chapter 47, because we know that Cyrus did not destroy Babylon, but made it even more beautiful than it was at the time. So he was wrong in respect to Babylon, in respect to the city of Babylon, but he was partially right in relation to the liberation of the Jews. The Jews did return. Not only Jews, but other people from that had been under Babylonian rule were permitted to return, but the return was not as glorious as is, of course, displayed in the book of Isaiah, in that second portion of the book of Isaiah. Wallnau, in his book, also mentions something, an archaeological discovery, just to emphasize the idea of Cyrus. An important archaeological discovery that is now at the British Museum. I remember a couple of years ago, we visited the British Museum and we came across what is called the famous Cyrus cylinder. And it is a clay cylinder written in the Akkadian language. It's a 6th century artifact. And there's a text written on the cylinder. And the text on the cylinder, of course, praises Cyrus, mentioning that he defeated the Babylonian king in the 6th century, Nabonidus. And and the cylinder, what's interesting, it also portrays Cyrus as being victorious, that he has been chosen by even the Babylonian god Marduk to restore peace and order amongst the Babylonians at the time. And the text also emphasizes the idea that Cyrus himself was very much welcomed by the people of Babylonia as their new ruler, and that he entered into the city in peace. And what's interesting is that he permitted, it concludes, this section concludes with a description on how Cyrus himself repaired the city wall of Babylonia, and found a similar inscription placed there by an earlier king. So it's interesting that biblical scholars, of course, use this as a kind of a proof that Cyrus was alive. Of course, the Bible talks about that in Isaiah. He was there, of course. And sometimes uses this as a proof that he permitted the Jews to return to their city. But at the same time, we need to be careful, because this interpretation is slightly disputed by other scholars, because the text itself mentions Mesopotamian sanctuaries, and there's no necessarily on the cylinder itself, there's no mention of Jews or Jerusalem or Judea. So it's possible, and it's possible that, of course, the Jews were permitted, but it's not as glorious as what the second Isaiah writer mentions about his hope for the Jewish people to be restored in their land. So, but you see just the picture of who Cyrus is, how he's positively portrayed. Of course, it's propaganda. It differs from what we can see happening to Donald Trump these days. He's not a very positive figure. He's a very polarizing individual. And what's interesting about the Cyrus cylinder, it has been often viewed as a kind of almost like a first declaration of human rights. Even if there was no such thing as human rights at the time, it seems a bit anachronistic to talk about human rights, but it's often used as a positive element of someone. It's kind of, even the director of the British Museum at the time was saying that it's one of the first attempts that we are aware of in history about running a society, a state with different nationalities and different faiths, a kind of a statescraft. So you see, it's very positive. The reign of Cyrus, the kind of figure that seems to unite individuals, and respect. What comes out of this is there's a profound respect for a lot of the different nationalities that had been conquered by the Babylonians. He permits people to return to their original lands, to restore their sanctuaries, to live out their faith in a particular, according to their customs and ways of life and traditions. This is completely different than what we see with Donald Trump, that really emphasizes on, it's not very positive with respect to multiple faiths. We've seen it with his traditional Muslim ban. We see it with, there's the emphasis is all about white culture more than anything else. So it's a dramatic opposite figure that we have between Cyrus and Trump. So there is a problem, you see, with this kind of comparison that this individual is doing in his book. His entire premise is problematic because, first of all, he misunderstands what the Bible says about Cyrus. He misunderstands what the book of Isaiah is all about, the various components and the various historical situations of the book of Isaiah. He misunderstands the fact that even the history around Cyrus and what he did, and and how Cyrus was not necessarily a polarizing figure, but was acclaimed as someone that was there to restore other people's heritage and culture. It's very, very different than what we see with Donald Trump. Of course, this individual boasts with the fact that he predicted Trump. And we have to admit, most of us were shocked by the victory, the electoral victory of Donald Trump. But others thought that it was possible for him to be elected. So you don't necessarily need a supernatural revelation to figure this out. At one point, you might see certain patterns in history and come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's possible that this individual might win because of grievances, because of what people are saying about their current situation, and how they feel dissatisfied with the Democrats, and how they felt cheated out of with the Obama administration and not respected, and evangelicals felt that they were in a culture war, and they felt marginalized by the former administration, and were, people are in a war against the left and progressiveness and progressives, and that's what he talks about essentially. He talks about the war against the left and the progressives, and he's all for conservatives. Of course, he's evangelical. In the end, when you get around these types of books, prophetic books, books that claim that Donald Trump is God's chosen individual, and that they use the Bible to actually prove this, you have to delve a little further into what constitutes the Bible and how they use the Bible to legitimize their position. So don't buy the book. I just told you what the premise is and how the problems and the many problems there are with that premise. So don't buy the book. I bought the book because I wanted to read the primary sources, and it's good sometimes to have a sense of what they're actually saying, but you don't have to spend money for this. So this is all for me this week. Thank you for tuning in. If you do enjoy these videos, please subscribe to my channel. You can also comment. You can also like the videos, and don't hesitate to share them and talk to others about this channel. Thank you once again for listening, and I will see you again next week with another comment, another commentary, another short clip on the impact of religion on today's world, and various aspects of violence tied into religion and how it plays into politics in our modern day and age. Thank you, and see you next week.